In 1980, a 70-year-old potato farmer in Boise, Idaho, wrote a check for $1 million to 4 guys working out of the basement of a dentist's office. He didn't understand the product. He couldn't have explained what a dynamic random access memory chip did if you'd offered him another $1 million to try. But when he signed the check, he said something like, "Boys, it's a gamble, and we're going to take it." This year, that company crossed $1 trillion in market value. That's Micron. And the reason I want to tell you this story isn't that it's a nice story about a lucky farmer. It's that the potato farmer understood something about the memory chip business that MIT-trained engineers, Japanese industrial planners, German conglomerates, and 2 national governments all failed to understand. And it cost them, collectively, tens of billions of dollars and their entire industries. Because the memory business is not really a technology business, for 40 years, it has been a game of chicken. 2 cars, 1 road, and the winner is whoever is most credibly willing to die. And the body count is extraordinary. In the mid-1980s, there were dozens of companies making DRAM. By 2008, there were about 10. Today, there are 3 that matter: Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. Everybody else is dead, absorbed, or reduced to a patent portfolio being picked over by strangers. So this is the story of how that happened. Who started the wars, why they thought they'd win, exactly how they lost, and why the survivors are now sitting on the most profitable industrial structure in modern technology, and whether it can possibly last. Let's start with the math, because the math is the whole thing. Everything strange about this industry falls out of one equation. Say you build a memory fab for $100 million. Say it makes 100 million chips. Your cost is $1 a chip. Now say you push that fab harder and get 200 million chips out of it. Your cost is 50 cents a chip. The fab costs the same either way. The building, the lithography tools, the clean room, the depreciation, none of it cares whether you're running or idle. Now flip it. Prices crash. Demand disappears. What does the textbook say to do? Cut production, reduce supply, wait for the market to clear. And here's the trap. In memory, cutting production makes your cost per chip go up. So you cut output, your unit cost rises, and you start losing even more money per chip than you were before. The rational response to a price collapse in this industry is to produce more, which of course makes the price collapse worse, which makes everyone produce more. That's not a market. That's a demolition derby with quarterly earnings reports. So how do you survive it? 3 things, and they're not complicated. 1. Get bigger. Scale isn't vanity here, it's cost. 2. Spend insanely on R&D, because shrinking your process node, getting more chips out of the same silicon wafer, is the only way to structurally lower cost. And notice the perversity. Every company shrinking its node is also increasing total industry supply, which pushes prices down again. The technology treadmill and the price collapse are the same machine. 3, and this is the one that actually decides who lives: hold a mountain of cash. People say memory is a business where you make a fortune in the good years and hand it all back in the bad ones. That's true. But if you don't have enough cash to cross the desert, you don't get to the next boom. And if you have more cash than everyone else, then the downturn isn't a disaster. The downturn is the knife. Samsung understood this better than anyone, and Samsung had a structural advantage nobody else did. It was a chaebol. It could pull money from affiliates, from insurance arms, from financial subsidiaries. When the memory division was bleeding, the memory division did not have to fund itself. Which is why, in the late 1990s, when DRAM prices were falling off a cliff, Samsung did the thing that made no sense and all the sense in the world. Everyone else was cutting. Samsung raised capital spending and raised its production targets. And to appreciate how audacious that was, look at the numbers on that crash. Between 1995 and 1998, average DRAM prices per megabit went from over $3 to under 16 cents. Prices fell 51% in 1996 and another 65% in 1997. That is not a cycle. That is a controlled implosion. And in the middle of it, the world's #1 memory maker was pouring in more capacity, on purpose, knowing exactly what it would do to everyone else's balance sheet. There's a lovely moment that captures the mindset. Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, wrote in his memoir about Samsung's late chairman, Lee Kun-hee, telling him he hoped Taiwan wouldn't get into the memory business, and adding roughly, "Come visit our factory, and you'll see how much capital and how much talent it takes to build a memory line." That is not friendly advice. That is a man describing a moat and inviting you to look down into it. Now let's back up, because there's an irony buried in the beginning of all this. Micron was founded in October 1978 by Ward Parkinson, his twin brother Joe, a lawyer, and 2 colleagues out of Mostek, the Texas chip company. They weren't trying to build a manufacturing empire. They were a design consultancy. Then they lost their only customer because Mostek got acquired. So 4 men in Idaho with no customer decided the obvious next step was to start manufacturing memory chips. The timing was catastrophic. This was the era when Japanese companies, Hitachi, NEC, Fujitsu, Toshiba, were flooding the world with DRAM that was cheaper and, humiliatingly, better. Intel exited DRAM in 1985. Motorola got out. Texas Instruments would eventually get out. American memory was being systematically dismantled. They went looking for money, and they did not go to Silicon Valley. They went to J.R. Simplot, the man who'd shaken hands with Ray Kroc in 1967 to supply McDonald's with frozen French fries and become one of the richest men in America doing it. A man who drove a white Lincoln town car with a license plate that said, Mr. SPUD. Simplot knew nothing about semiconductors. He knew everything about one sentence: memory is a commodity. He'd spent his life in a business where prices crashed, where the low-cost producer ate everyone else's lunch, and where the moment to buy in was when prices were on the floor and your competitors were liquidating. He looked at the Japanese dumping DRAM into the market, and he didn't see a threat. He saw the bottom of a potato cycle. So he put in $1 million for 40% of the company. By the mid-1990s, that stake was worth around $4 billion. And Simplot's other contribution was a refusal. He insisted Micron stay in Boise rather than burn money on California real estate like everyone else. That decision looks sentimental. It was ruthless. Cheaper land, cheaper electricity, and the underrated one, dramatically lower employee turnover. In an industry where process knowledge lives in the heads of the people who run the tools, having engineers who stay for 20 years is a cost advantage that never shows up in a press release. Micron built its first fab for around $10 million, a fraction of what the Japanese were spending. It made the world's smallest 256K DRAM, smallest die, more chips per wafer, lower cost per chip. Talk to Micron engineers today, and you hear the same phrase over and over. The whole company is obsessed with efficiency. Simplify the process steps, shrink the die, get more out of every wafer, every tool, every hour. That obsession is 40 years old, and it was born out of fear. Micron also did something else in the 1980s. It fought. In June 1985, Micron filed an anti-dumping petition against Japanese 64K DRAMs. The International Trade Commission found that Micron had suffered material injury. Its chairwoman noted that Japanese dumping into a collapsing market produced a price decline that was devastating to the industry, and that 6 companies had stopped making the chip entirely. That case, plus others, led to the 1986 US-Japan Semiconductor Agreement. And here's the irony I promised. In 1983, Micron, desperate for cash, licensed its 64K DRAM design to a company that had never made a memory chip in its life, Samsung. Samsung went from nothing to sampling a 64K DRAM in about 6 months on Micron's design, then fabricated a Micron 256K design, and then reverse-engineered its own 256K in order to stop paying royalties. Micron sold the blueprints to the company that would spend the next 4 decades trying to bury it. That's not incompetence. That's what a cash-starved company does. But it tells you something true about this industry. Everybody's survival strategy creates somebody else's opening. By 1993, Samsung was the world's #1 memory maker. And by the late 1990s, it was running the chicken game playbook at full volume. Prices collapsed. Oversupply dragged on far longer than it should have, and company after company found itself selling chips at or below cost, with no end in sight. But Micron didn't fight that war the way Samsung did. Micron did something smarter and colder. It went shopping. In 1998, Texas Instruments gave up on memory. Micron bought the whole thing, the fabs, the joint venture stakes, for roughly $800 million in stock and assumed debt. And here's the detail that tells you how badly TI wanted out. As part of the deal, TI handed Micron $550 million in cash to help deploy Micron's technology across the acquired plants. Micron didn't just buy a business, it got paid to take it. Overnight, Micron went from a scrappy survivor to a core player. Then, in 2002, came the deal that would have changed everything. Micron tried to buy Hynix. Hynix, formerly Hyundai Electronics, was in a hole of its own making. Under government encouragement, it had swallowed LG Semicon in 1999 for over $2 billion and inherited an enormous pile of debt. When DRAM prices collapsed to $1 in late 2001, it became, in the Korean market's own mocking phrase, a national penny stock, kept breathing by state-backed creditor banks. Micron offered around 108 million shares, worth close to $3.5 billion, plus an investment. The creditors agreed. And part of Micron's plan was explicit: temporarily shut some Hynix fabs to pull supply out of the market. This wasn't just an acquisition, it was an act of industrial arson insurance. Then, the Hynix board met for 6 hours and unanimously killed it. Their reasoning? Micron's stock was overvalued, the liabilities were understated, prices had just ticked up, and they thought they could make it alone. Wall Street's verdict at the time was withering. Analysts said Hynix would now just make life miserable for the healthy companies and probably die within a year anyway. Here is what actually happened. Hynix spent nearly a decade under creditor control. It sold its LCD business, spun off its phone unit, exited logic and foundry, and shrank down to memory and nothing else. It survived on emergency asset sales and bailouts. By 2005, the New York Times was calling it a comeback story. In 2012, SK Group bought control for around $3 billion, and Standard & Poor's promptly put SK Telecom on negative outlook, essentially saying, "Are you insane? Buying into memory?" And in 2013, that same company completed the world's first HBM, high bandwidth memory. DRAM stacked vertically with holes drilled through the silicon. It was expensive. It was technically brutal, and there were functionally no customers. The high-performance computing ecosystem wasn't ready. The internal team faced the obvious question: why are we still doing this? They kept doing it. Today, SK Hynix supplies the majority of the world's HBM. Every AI accelerator on Earth needs it. And the company has posted operating margins in the 70s, the highest ever recorded in the semiconductor industry. If that Hynix board had said yes in 2002, Micron would very likely have passed Samsung and become the world's largest memory maker. And the company that invented the chip powering the entire AI boom would not exist. That's the single most consequential no in the history of the industry. Now, before we get to the two great chicken games, I have to tell you about the part that nobody puts in the inspirational version of this story. While all this brave counter-cyclical warfare was going on, the executives were also, quietly, on the phone with each other, fixing prices. The U.S. Justice Department's DRAM cartel case is one of the biggest antitrust prosecutions in American history. Infineon pleaded guilty in 2004 and paid $160 million. Hynix pleaded guilty in 2005, $185 million. Samsung pleaded guilty in 2005, $300 million. Elpida in 2006, $84 million. 18 individuals were charged. 15 were convicted. Infineon executives went to prison for 4 to 6 months each. And a Micron regional sales manager was charged with obstruction of justice for withholding and altering documents subpoenaed by the grand jury. Micron itself escaped a fine because Micron was the first through the door as a cooperator. Think about what that tells you. The price mechanism in this business is so violent that the people running it couldn't stand it. They'd give speeches about scale and efficiency and technology roadmaps, and then they'd call each other up to agree on a number, because the alternative was watching their margins get eaten alive by a market they had built with their own capital. Okay, the first great chicken game, 2007. Here's the part that surprises people. It wasn't started by the leader. It was started by the smallest players in the market, the Taiwanese. At the time, the market looked roughly like this. Samsung, about 30%, Hynix, 19%, Japan's Elpida, 15%, Micron, 11%, Germany's Qimonda, 10%, then Taiwan's Powerchip, around 5%, and Nanya, around 4%, plus a tail of others. 10-ish companies. And the Taiwanese had a theory, and it wasn't a stupid one. They had no leading-edge DRAM technology of their own, so they built an alliance. Japanese and German technology plus Taiwanese manufacturing capacity. Elpida and Qimonda supply the process. Nanya, Inotera, Powerchip, and Promos run the fabs. The logic was almost military. Samsung is one company. We are a coalition. Combine German and Japanese process technology with the cheapest manufacturing on Earth. Surround Samsung with volume and bleed it out. They had a second reason for confidence. The Taiwanese government. Taipei was running a program called 2 Trillion Twin Star, designed to make semiconductors and flat panel displays the twin pillars of the national economy. Subsidies, tax breaks, cheap loans, all pointed at DRAM. So the calculation became, even if we lose money, we can't die. The state is behind us. Flood the market, push prices below cost, and the companies without a government sponsor die first. And their third reason was Windows Vista. Vista shipped in 2007, and the entire memory industry had decided it was going to be the savior. It was a heavy operating system. Every PC on Earth would need more DRAM. Upgrade cycle, demand explosion, build the fabs now. Vista, as you may recall, was not a triumph. It was bloated, it was buggy, consumers refused it, corporations skipped it. The demand wave never arrived. But the fabs got built anyway, and the chips came out anyway. Oversupply, plus a delusional demand forecast. Plus, starting in 2008, the global financial crisis. DRAM went from about $6.80 to about 50 cents. Qimonda's own bankruptcy filing put it plainly. DRAM prices dropped 85% in 2007 and another 58% in 2008. Now watch the alliance work in a crisis. It didn't. The technology providers were dying, so the process upgrades the Taiwanese fabs depended on simply stopped. Their whole strategy was rented, and the landlord went bankrupt. Meanwhile, Samsung, an integrated manufacturer that owned its own technology, could decide things in a morning. The third quarter of 2008 is one of the most brutal set of numbers in industrial history. Samsung, still profitable, about $200 million of operating profit. Hynix, minus $400 million, a negative 28% margin. Micron, minus $450 million, minus 35%. Nanya, minus 69%. PowerChip, an operating margin of minus 100%, meaning it cost them twice what they got for the chips. By the fourth quarter, even Samsung broke, posting a loss of about $900 million. At the very worst of it, Samsung's memory operating margin was around minus 30%. The best run, lowest cost, most heavily armed player in the industry was losing 30 cents on the dollar. That's the thing to hold on to. Chicken games don't hurt the loser and spare the winner. They hurt everyone. The winner is just the one who can bleed longest. Qimonda, number 5 in the world, roughly 10% share, the crown jewel of Europe's biggest semiconductor cluster in Dresden, went first. It closed its Vermont operations. It laid off over 1,000 people in Richmond, Virginia. The New York Stock Exchange notified it that its market capitalization had fallen below $100 million. Its cumulative losses from late 2007 through the end of 2008 exceeded $3 billion. It received around $500 million of German state support, and on January 23, 2009, it filed for insolvency anyway. Europe's DRAM industry ended that day and has never come back. Elpida got to the edge and was pulled back. About $240 million of Japanese government money and $90 million from creditors in February 2009. The Taiwanese, proportionally, suffered worst of all, and they survived only on government support and their parent companies. Taipei then tried something remarkable. It created a national champion from scratch called Taiwan Memory Company to consolidate the wreckage and license foreign technology. It collapsed. Nanya's president said publicly, more or less, that the government shouldn't be in the business of building companies. Micron, meanwhile, quietly did a deal with Nanya and Inotera instead. Taiwan had spent a fortune building DRAM into a national pillar, and what remained was an empty shell. And Hynix? Hynix held on because it was genuinely second in both share and technology. But its operating margin hit minus 53%. Its book value was cut in half, and its stock fell from around 40,000 won to the 5,000 range, an 8-fold collapse. There were serious conversations about selling it to another conglomerate, or to Micron, again. Then the economy recovered, prices recovered, and everyone made money for about 18 months. And then, in 2010, somebody started it again. Also not the leader, Elpida. Elpida had 3 reasons, and again, this is the pattern. Each one was individually rational. Reason 1 was the exchange rate. The yen went to an all-time high, 70-something to the dollar. Samsung and Hynix, with a weak won, could make money selling a single chip. Elpida was structurally underwater before it did anything at all. Its costs were in yen, and its revenue was in dollars. So Elpida reasoned, if we're losing money per chip because of currency, the only lever we have is volume. Run the fabs flat out, crush the fixed cost and depreciation per unit, and get our costs down to where we can match Samsung's price. Reason 2 was the government money. After 2009, Tokyo had put roughly 30 billion yen of public funds and 100 billion yen of loans into Elpida to save the pride of Japanese semiconductors. And once you take the taxpayer's money, you owe the taxpayer visible results. Not, we quietly improved our fundamentals over 5 years. Market share, a technology leap, something you can announce. So the money went into capacity to defend near-term share, rather than into the process R&D that was the actual problem. Japanese taxpayers ended up funding, mostly, the order books of semiconductor equipment companies. Reason 3 was genuinely smart, and it still killed them. Elpida saw smartphones coming and decided to pivot from PC DRAM to mobile DRAM. That was the right call, years early, and correct. Elpida became a major mobile memory supplier to Apple. The problem was yield. The process transition went slower than planned, and a flood of defective and off-spec parts came out the other end. And what do you do with off-spec DRAM? You dump it on the PC spot market at whatever price you can get. So Elpida's brilliant strategic pivot ended up personally accelerating the collapse of the very prices it needed to survive. DDR3 went from about $3 to about $1. And by then, Samsung had a stable 40-nanometer class process and a cost structure Elpida simply could not touch. Samsung absorbed the volume attack and kept firing. On February 27, 2012, Elpida filed for bankruptcy protection with 448 billion yen of debt, about $5.5 billion, the largest manufacturer bankruptcy in post-war Japanese history. Its president, Yukio Sakamoto, told reporters they had waited for offers to the last minute and gotten intentions rather than commitments. The stock closed at 1 yen before delisting. Japan had invented modern DRAM dominance. Japan now had no DRAM industry. And then, Micron did the greatest deal in the history of the memory business. The headline price for Elpida was 200 billion yen. But look at the structure. Micron paid 60 billion yen in cash at closing for 100% of the company. The remaining 140 billion yen was paid in 6 annual installments from 2014 through 2019, funded out of the cash flow Elpida generated doing foundry work for Micron. Interest-free installments paid by the acquired company out of money the acquirer sent it for services. Micron bought the world's number 3 DRAM maker with $750 million in real cash and a payment plan. And what did that buy? Micron was strong in PC DRAM and weak in mobile. Elpida was a major mobile DRAM supplier to Apple. So in a single transaction, Micron entered the mobile memory market and walked into Apple's supply chain. There's a shadow over that triumph, by the way. Micron's CEO, Steve Appleton, a man who had been fired in 1996 and rehired 8 days later, which tells you something about how indispensable he was, died in a plane crash outside Boise on February 3, 2012. 3.5 weeks later, Elpida filed. The deal was closed by his successor. Micron kept going. It had already grabbed Qimonda's 35.5% stake in Taiwan's Inoterra, as Qimonda was drowning in 2008. In 2016, it bought the rest and made Inoterra a wholly owned subsidiary, plugging Taiwan's manufacturing operations straight into Micron's global R&D network and giving it a foothold in the Taiwanese supply chain. That's the Micron pattern. In one sentence, never start the war and buy the casualties at a discount. You can see the same conservatism in a decision that looked, for a while, like a mistake. In the late 2010s, ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography tools arrived, and they were the future, and also absurdly expensive, with low early yields and long, painful process learning. Samsung and SK Hynix went in boldly. Micron delayed and pushed its existing tools to the absolute limit, to protect its cost structure. That is the company Simplot funded, still running the same instinct 40 years later. Be the cheapest, not the earliest. So, what did 4 decades of blood buy? 3 companies. And what's fascinating is that each survived a completely different way. Samsung survived as the conqueror. Overwhelming capital, chaebol funding, preemptive capacity, willingness to eat a minus 30% margin to make you eat minus 100. SK Hynix survived as the fighter, nearly liquidated, run by its creditors for a decade, stripped down to nothing but memory. And it kept developing technology anyway, including a stacked memory product nobody wanted for years that turned out to be the key component of the AI era. Micron survived as the hunter, obsessive cost discipline in Idaho, and a graveyard strategy of buying the fallen for cents. And the market these 3 created is structurally different from the one they came out of. When there were 10 players, restraint was pointless. If you cut output, somebody else filled the gap and took your customer. With 3 players, everybody can see the whole board. Everybody knows that if any one of them expands recklessly, all 3 get destroyed together. The paradigm has flipped from market share to profit maximization. That's the strongest argument that the classic chicken game, the kind that ends with a major player filing for bankruptcy, is essentially over. And it's reinforced by 2 other things. First, there's no one left to kill. You can't reduce 3 players to 2. Second, and bigger, semiconductors are now strategic national assets. This is no longer a market where companies get to fight in private. If Samsung tried to drive SK Hynix into bankruptcy, the Korean government would not permit it. SK Hynix is now one of the most valuable companies in Korea. If Samsung went after Micron, it would be picking a fight with Washington. And the instant anyone smells a coordinated attempt to force a competitor out, competition regulators on 3 continents will be reading the emails. These people have already been to prison once, which leaves exactly one plausible route to another war: China. And here is where the story loops back on itself in a way I find genuinely eerie. Remember Qimonda, dead in January 2009, Europe's DRAM champion, killed in the first chicken game? Qimonda left behind something valuable, roughly 10,000 patents, a complete DRAM cell architecture, and a full process heritage developed entirely outside the Samsung, Hynix, Micron triangle, the one alternative DRAM genome on Earth. In 2016, a new company was founded in Hefei, China, called Changshin Memory Technologies. It got started by acquiring patents and talent traceable to Qimonda's estate. Then it received nearly a decade of patient capital from the Hefei municipal government, which tolerated losses year after year after year. CXMT made its first annual profit in 2025. Its revenue went from about $3.3 billion in 2024 to $8.6 billion in 2025, and then did $7.3 billion in the first quarter of 2026 alone. It listed on Shanghai's Star Market this summer in one of the largest semiconductor IPOs China has ever done, and the stock rose 466% on debut, giving it a market capitalization north of $480 billion, larger at that moment than Intel. It reached about 7% of the global DRAM market in the second quarter of this year, the fastest growing supplier in the world. Nomura thinks 18% by 2028. Others think China could hold 30% of DRAM by 2030. On capacity, some analysts project CXMT will exit this year within a rounding error of Micron's wafer output. The corpse of the first chicken game became the seed of the 4th player. So, could Samsung wage a chicken game against CXMT? Ask the question properly. Could Samsung win a war of attrition against the balance sheet of the Chinese state? Taiwan's government
couldn't sustain the losses. Japan's government couldn't. Germany's government couldn't. And it only had to write one check. You cannot bankrupt a company whose shareholder does not require a return.
Which brings us to right now. And right now is the strangest chapter of all. Because after 40 years of chronic oversupply, the memory industry is in the most severe shortage in about 15 years. In the second quarter of 2026, DRAM contract prices rose 58 to 63% in a single quarter. NAND rose 70 to 75%. The supply-demand gap is the widest since 2011. Spot DRAM prices are up something like 700% over a year. Why? Because the three survivors have shifted their fabs toward high-bandwidth memory and high-end server DRAM for AI. Data centers now absorb an estimated 70% of all memory produced on the planet. And the memory that used to go into your laptop and your phone is being squeezed out of existence. Smartphone shipments are forecast to fall nearly 13% this year. PCs over 11%. Not because nobody wants them, but because the memory is too expensive to put in them. SK Hynix chief executive has said publicly he expects this shortage to last past 2030. Micron's market value has risen roughly 840% in a year and crossed $1 trillion. SK Hynix, the national penny stock, the company the board saved from Micron in a 6-hour meeting, is now worth around $1 trillion too, and rings the bell at the NASDAQ. But the price surge isn't the interesting part. Price surges are what memory does. The interesting part is that the product is changing, and the product change is what actually kills the chicken game. Simplot's insight was memory is a commodity. And for 45 years, that was the deepest truth in the industry. Look at HBM4. The stack sits on a logic base die, and that base die is made on a foundry process. Samsung is using a 4-nanometer node for its HBM4 logic die, and reaching for 2-nanometer for custom versions. SK Hynix is working with TSMC, using a 12-nanometer process for mainstream server base dies, and going to 3-nanometer for premium designs, aimed at NVIDIA's flagship GPUs and Google's TPUs. All three are racing to finish custom HBM designs for individual customers. Custom for one customer. Company designed, individually qualified on a foundry node. That is not a commodity. That is a foundry business, wearing a memory badge. And it comes with foundry-like commercial terms, long-term agreements, strategic customer agreements, guaranteed volumes. Micron has been signing them, including a long-term memory supply deal with General Motors, and reportedly capping prices for existing products at this year's second quarter market price. SK Hynix has gone the other way, reportedly removing the price cap altogether, so a shortage flows straight into its contracts. That divergence is the whole future of this industry, in miniature. A price cap is a trade. You give up the top of the spot market in exchange for knowing your fab is full. HBM4 pricing is forecast to go from around $2 a gigabit to $4 or $5. The pressure to keep that upside is enormous. The pressure to lock in certainty is also enormous. Nobody knows the right answer yet. And yes, people will point out that a long-term agreement can be torn up. Sure, and if it is, you cut the wafer starts on that custom part, exactly the way TSMC dials back a node when iPhones don't sell. That's not a catastrophe. That's a normal manufacturing business. I'm not telling you the cycle is dead. Memory will always have a cycle, but the amplitude is changing, because the thing being sold is changing. Which means the last thing to go might be how we think about these companies. For 40 years, memory makers were valued on price to book. Because what else do you value in a business where the product is interchangeable and the assets are just buildings full of depreciating machines that periodically make no money at all? You value the buildings. But you don't value a foundry on the price of its buildings. You value it on the durability of its customer relationships. So here's where I'd leave it. The potato farmer was right for 45 years. He saw a commodity, he bought at the bottom, and he turned $1 million into billions, while the smartest technologists in Japan, Germany, and Taiwan got wiped out by an equation they understood perfectly and couldn't escape. In this business, the winner was never the one with the best chip. It was the one who could survive the longest while selling below cost. The wars are probably over. There's no one left to kill, no government that would allow it, and for now, no reason to try. Because for the first time in the history of the industry, the three survivors get to be the ones who set the price. The question worth watching is whether they can remember what it cost them to get here. Because the one thing every casualty in this story had in common, Qimonda, Elpida, PowerChip, Promos, Hynix in 2001, is that at the moment they made the decision that killed them, they were absolutely certain they were being rational.